Hello, I'm Rath Perales. Welcome to Leyes Cotidianas, or Everyday Law, where we talk about the laws that affect you every day. Today we're going to be discussing identity theft and identity fraud. What can you do to avoid it, and what can you do if you're a victim? Next on Leyes Cotidianas. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be discussing identity fraud and identity theft. And I have the pleasure of having Chris Timmons, who's an assistant district attorney with the DeKalb County.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And you are one of those prosecutors who prosecutes people for committing identity theft and identity fraud.
Yes, that's correct.
Why don't you start by sort of explaining what constitutes identity theft, what is the difference between identity theft and identity fraud. Just tell us what the law is.
Pretty much they're the same thing. Identity theft, identity fraud, we use those terms in the prosecution world interchangeably. What identity fraud or identity theft is when someone uses identifying information, and that could be anything from a name, most commonly a credit card number or a checking account number, to access somebody's resources. And resources can be anything from their medical information, can be their, typically their financial resources, things like a bank account, a credit card account, something along those lines.
Okay. It could also be somebody using somebody's insurance information to get treatment.
Absolutely. It could be that as well.
Have you seen cases where you've had to prosecute?
I've seen one. That most of the cases that I see involve somebody's checking account, particularly from a business side or in terms of consumers. We see mostly their credit cards being accessed and used for fraudulent purposes.
Okay, well, give us some examples. What do you see in most? I mean, usually this kind of crimes, they kind of go sort of in waves, where they kind of redress them, repackage them,
sure.
And then, but it's the same crime, which is trying to steal somebody's identity for financial purposes most of the time.
Sure, and there too, from our business victims, and a business can be, believe it or not, a victim of identity fraud as well under the statute. Businesses can be victims, consumers can be victims. So I'll classify them in terms of business victims and consumer victims. Business victims, the most common scam that I have seen is their checking account. What will happen is someone will get a business's checking account number, they'll issue paychecks with that bank account, and then they'll find people, usually pick them up sometimes just on the side of the road. They'll tell them, I'll give you 10%. If you go into this bank and cash this paycheck, you give me 90%, you get to keep 10%, you go on your way. And unfortunately in that situation, usually the bad guys, the real bad guys are on their way. It's the person who cashed the check and only got 10% that's left on the hook.
I think that there used to be a name for that, like the pigeon drop or something similar.
Well, you can call them a pigeon. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about, but yeah, it's I mean, you can call them a pigeon, but unfortunately they're sort of a secondary victim. But anybody who knows that they're going in and cashing a paycheck for work that they didn't do is committing a crime.
Well, but okay, so the bank gives the money. I mean, you're
Yes.
talking about they deposit into their account so the bank can take back the money.
Or sometimes it's cash. Actually, usually it's going to be a cash type situation. They don't deposit it into their account, although I have seen that too. That's a pretty common scam. It was a more common scam when the economy was suffering and unemployment was even higher than it is now. In that scam, people would see ads on Craigslist for a job where they were cashing checks. And so somebody would make up a story about how they needed somebody to cash checks for them in Atlanta and then wire the money back to them. In that case, the person would get 10%. They thought that they were actually doing a legitimate job, but in that situation, also a crime, unfortunately.
Okay. All right.
If it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Right, and so that is something that you see in a lot of on
the business side.
Business side, okay.
On the consumer side, most of what we're seeing relates to credit cards. I think the two big stories that have been in the news recently, you've seen Home Depot, you've seen Target, where consumers use their credit card or their debit card at a retailer of some sort. That information is uploaded to corporate, and then some way hackers get access to that information and often sell it on the black market. And often in foreign countries.
Okay, all right. So, and I want to talk to you about, enforcement of these
Yes.
laws, prosecutions in a second.
Absolutely.
Let's finish talking about what the law is. What are the penalties?
Sure. It depends. As far as just a straight up identity theft or identity fraud in the usual situation, it's 1 to 10 years treated as a felony and $100,000. Now that's a lot of discretion by a prosecutor or a judge as to what to do, and that there's no requirement. Like armed robbery, for example, somebody who gets to 10 years, that's going to be served in prison. The 1 to 10 on an identity fraud is going to be probation, sometimes prison, but most of the cases I've dealt with, almost all of the cases I've dealt with, it's a probationary type offense, but it's once or twice.
Is there a threshold on the amount? Like, for instance, when you write a bad check, if it's more than $500, it's a felony. If it's less than $500, it's a misdemeanor.
No, accessing somebody's resources is a felony if it's 1 penny or $1 million. It doesn't matter what the amount is.
Okay.
It's still identity theft.
Now,
but that might be treated in your situation, even though you're talking about a checking account, that's probably more likely to be treated as a misdemeanor forgery case, even though it technically could also be identity fraud.
so, I mean, there's some leeway with the prosecutor office to sort of, lower the charges to a misdemeanor.
And actually, it's what's called the rule of lenity. If you've got 2 crimes that can be charged, and this is across the United States, it's actually a constitutional issue, then the lesser has to be charged. So if it could fit both into a misdemeanor category or into a felony category, it's got to be treated as a misdemeanor. A real common one is a fake ID. College kid will go out, they'll get a fake ID so that they can buy alcohol, something that says they're 21. If they use that ID, technically they're committing first-degree forgery. But we have a statute in Georgia for fake IDs, it's a misdemeanor, so it's got to be treated as misdemeanor fake ID.
And let's make it clear also that in that situation, usually people say it's a victimless crime.
Sure.
We're not stealing money from anybody, but it's still a crime. It's the act of portraying yourself under a false identity that is the crime. Is that correct?
No, I mean, in some ways, the merchant gets their money, the kid gets the beer, but it's a violation of a Georgia statute, so the kid gets prosecuted for not for identity fraud, rather, but in that case, it'd be a fake ID case.
Right. Now, also, a few years back, I believe 2005, 2006, the law was also changed to deal with identity. Not fraud, but when somebody uses a false identity to get a job, which was part of the Immigration Reform Act that Georgia passed back then.
Yes.
That carries the penalties a little higher too.
Sure, that's 1 to 15, and I believe a $250,000 fine.
Right.
I've never seen it prosecuted as under that statute. That adds an element that isn't necessarily there on that whole employment situation. And generally, although it carries a higher penalty, it's not going to be treated any differently than, at least from a prosecution standpoint. Most likely, your sentences there are probably going to be 3 to 5 years, whether it's for employment or whether it is for your garden variety identity fraud. And I'm talking about limited situations where you've got one victim. If you talk about a scheme, you're dealing with hundreds or even thousands of victims, that's going to be treated very differently.
Okay, and not to get into the politics of it, and I don't want to get into the politics of the immigration and all that, but some people say, gee whiz, it's a victimless crime because all this person wants to do is work, not steal money from somebody. Is it truly a victim?
Well, it depends on where the information came from. The cases that I've seen where that's done, I've seen a couple of them. One is where a child's Social Security number was used, and you think, okay, well, that probably benefits the child. They're getting money into their Social Security account even before they start working. But the problem is, suddenly you involve the IRS. And in my experience, and no offense to anybody that's an IRS agent out there that's watching, they're not the easiest entity to deal with. And so in that situation, the kid might incur some tax liability. It could cause all kinds of future problems because their Social Security number was used. And so while it seems on the outset to be a victimless crime, in that situation, it really isn't. And so we ended up prosecuting that case because that child had issues. They had to get things straight with the IRS. It was a hassle for the parents, really.
Now, obviously, and I don't know if in that case sounds like the child was somebody other than the person, the person that used that wasn't the father of that child.
No. They were strangers.
Right, but have you seen any prosecutions where the father, let's say an undocumented alien, used the information from his child, who's a U.S. citizen?
I haven't personally seen it. I mean, it may have happened. It may have been prosecuted. I don't know. I think the issue there is, just like any crime, as one of my former bosses used to say, there's kind of 3 levels of crime. There's they did it, There's we know they did it, and there's we can prosecute it because we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt that they did it. And so that first level, I don't think anybody would ever figure out that happened. Now, if it did, certainly that would be one that would probably be prosecuted.
And I suspect
I can't
also,
speak for everybody.
But I suspect also the way you receive the cases to prosecute is through the police.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, you're not going out there investigating crimes.
It's just like Law and Order. The investigation is done by the police department or the governor's office of consumer affairs or the various entities that look into that. Sometimes the federal government, maybe the Secret Service, the Postal Service, postal inspectors do a lot with identity fraud. Those cases are then going to come to us.
So you're limited to crimes where people go to the police to report a crime, and then, of course, it's passed on to you.
We've got plenty of business. We typically don't go looking for it.
Right. Okay. All righty. So now, prosecuting this case also can be a little bit difficult, particularly today when there's so much internet-based fraud, and you got companies, that can be in California or it can be in Eastern Europe. We all get those emails from Africa. I think Nigeria kind of built a reputation for that. And so how do you prosecute somebody who's in Eastern Europe?
It can be done. Now, something like that's probably going to be handled federally. The postal inspectors do a fair amount of dealing with international fraud, so does the Secret Service. I haven't personally handled a prosecution where the defendant was in a foreign country, but technically we could. The venue on the identity fraud statute indicates that it's anywhere where the victim resides. So if somebody lives in DeKalb County, Georgia, and their resources are accessed in some way in, let's say, Romania, then we could technically go after the Romanian who committed that crime, bring them back to DeKalb County through their ways to extradite people from foreign countries and prosecute them here. Now, at the same time, if we're talking about a couple $100 loss, and we're also talking about limited tax dollars, the citizens may not think that that's the best use of their money.
You got to be judicious. But okay, so difficult to go overseas for obvious reasons. But how about within the United States? Have you ever prosecuted anybody in the United States outside of the state of Georgia?
Yes, and I prosecuted victims who, I had one case where I had a victim who was from California. His resources were actually used at a bank here in Georgia. I'm trying to think, I've done a couple from surrounding states, but again, it's a matter of resources. And that doesn't mean that we won't indict the case, it's just a matter of the expenses of extraditing someone. But if it's a big enough case and a big enough loss, and I don't mean to belittle anyone who's had their identity stolen and had just a limited loss, but if it's a big enough loss, certainly we'll spend money.
Sure. Now, let's talk about situations where perhaps somebody operates under a different name, and there's a legitimate reason, maybe it's not a legal name. You can have actors with stage names, or you can have folks that have maybe a nickname that is very different from their name. I mean, are they committing fraud if I go get a job and I say my name is Bobby instead of Robert?
No, well, there's two parts. Actually, there's other portions of the statute as well. The first part is it's got to be identifying information. It can be fraudulent, you're right, but normally the situation we're going to prosecute is there's an actual victim. The second part is to access that person's resources. And in this case, you're accessing your own resources, so you're not going to be prosecuted for that. The other thing is it has to be willfully and fraudulently. There's nothing fraudulent in that situation about you going out and getting a job. You're just getting a job under the stage name. It's you doing the work. It's the employer getting the benefit from it.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot then, because that kind of raises an interesting point, and that can be under that identity, false identity statute. If I go get a job and I just make up a name and I make up a social security number, okay? I'm not accessing anybody's resources, okay? So would I be prosecuted in that situation? I mean, does the statute prohibit the act of securing a job under false information?
Well, jobs do count as resources, and that's interesting because unfortunately, I have to look at the statute to tell you exactly what that was. But it has to be willfully and it has to be fraudulently. So if you're doing it with the intent to defraud, that is to pretend to be someone you're not, then that would be fraudulent. In the case where you're going in there and you're giving them the name and that's who you are, that's perfectly fine. So if you got a stage name, that's part of who you are. There's no intent to defraud there.
Okay, all righty. So let's talk about what can you do if you are a victim. I think I've heard that just opens up a Pandora box of nightmare trying to resolve your credit reports, and it just lingers on for years and years. I mean, what do you suggest?
It depends on what's stolen. Okay. The first thing, if it's any of your resources that are stolen, your checking account, your credit card number, that's one situation. In that situation, or any of the situations, you should go to your local police department. Now, in Georgia and in the metro Atlanta area in particular, that's going to be your local precinct. Cobb County is a little bit different because Cobb County identity fraud and identity theft is investigated by the Cobb County Sheriff's Department. So if you're a victim, you live in Cobb County, you should go to the Sheriff's Department there. Otherwise, it's your local police. Don't dial 911, please. Use that for emergencies, but contact your local department and tell them that you've been a victim of identity theft. They're required by law to take a report at that point.
Right, and good idea to keep that report with you because you're going to have to show it to a lot of people.
The banks, yes. And that's the other thing. The clock is ticking. If you catch it right away before there are any funds that are taken out of your bank account, then you're not going to have any losses. If you wait 2 days and there are losses, it's limited to $50. If you wait 60 days, then it's limited to a $500 loss. And if you wait longer than 60 days to notify the bank, once you know that you've been a victim of fraud, then at that point, the losses could be unlimited.
And let me ask you a question. This may go a little bit outside your field, but if my Social Security number has been stolen,
right.
Is it possible for me to contact Social Security and get a new number?
I don't know the answer to that question. That would be a question for Social Security.
Okay.
And so I really don't know.
I mean, I would imagine, because otherwise you're going to continue to have this problem the rest of your life. So I would imagine they would be able to sort of link your number to a new one to stop.
Well, I can tell you, one of the things, and I'm sorry I don't know the answer to that question. If somebody is a victim, one of your viewers is a victim, they should contact the Social Security Administration. But another thing you need to do is have a fraud report issued. If it's a credit card or a checking account, basically it ends with the bank.
Okay. And so what is the next step then? We report, and of course we ought to notify the parties that are involved, like a credit card.
Yep.
What else can I do to?
If somebody's taking your Social Security number, if they're actually pretending to be you and they're setting up accounts, not just accessing existing accounts, but if they're setting up accounts as you, what you need to do then is notify the credit agencies. A great source, there's about a 60-page booklet that's available on the web, and it addresses pretty much every scenario that can happen to a consumer. It's put out by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. It's accessible on the web at ftc.gov, and it's a great booklet, a great resource, because it really walks you through all the steps that you should take if you are a victim of identity fraud. But you should notify all 3 credit bureaus that somebody is attempting to be you. They've accessed your resources, things like your date of birth, your name, and they're setting up accounts. That will then notify all of the other creditors out there that if somebody goes to take out a credit card in your name using your resources, that they shouldn't issue that credit card.
Okay, in the case you mentioned where the victim was here in Georgia and the person committed the identity fraud in another state, do you recommend that the victim file a report in both jurisdictions?
Absolutely.
Or filing it in your office, let's say DeKalb County is the proper venue, would that automatically, take care of?
I've seen that. It really depends on the police department. I mean, it won't come to the DA's office unless there's an arrest made, and then at that point we'll take care of the prosecution of the person. But as far as the police work that takes to get it to a district attorney's office, either here in Georgia or California or Montana or wherever you're talking about, I'd notify both entities. I'd notify both where it happened, where their information was used, and I'd also notify the entity that is your local police department. The local police department is the most important one because you want to develop that report that then you're going to use to go to the banks, the various entities where your information has been used. But in order to help us catch the person, really helpful if you notify their local. They may be aware of this person. You may not be the only victim. They could be victimizing people all over the United States. And so it's really helpful for that local police department or that local sheriff's department in the other state to know that this person is operating in their jurisdiction using somebody else's information to victimize people.
Okay. And if the crime has been committed overseas, obviously, yes, report it to DeKalb County. You're going to need that police report. But does the person need to notify either the postal investigative agency or the
It's the
FBI,
postal inspectors.
The postal inspectors.
Before I became a prosecutor, I didn't know the postal inspectors existed, but they do a fair amount of that. Most identity fraud, individual crimes are going to be handled at the local level. Now, when we're talking about a scheme, then that's when you involve the federal government. But I've seen cases where you've got, unfortunately, and no disrespect to people who work in the Postal Service, but there have been a few in Atlanta where there's folks that are either mailmen, mail postal carriers, or folks that work at the post office themselves who are stealing checks that came in or credit cards right out of the mail. In that situation, if you're a victim because your mail has been stolen, the people you want to contact are the postal inspectors.
Okay.
But if you call the FBI for something where your credit card was used, they're going to direct you to your local police department.
Right. It's a matter of resources. The criminal prosecution is not the only thing that can help solve this problem. You can also have a civil claim, correct?
You can.
One doesn't prevent the other.
No, absolutely. The Georgia statute provides for lawsuits against folks that have accessed other people's resources. I believe attorney's fees can be gotten from that. That means that if you are successful in suing somebody who've accessed your resources, it can pay for the attorneys. I believe there are punitive damages as well, which means that above and beyond the loss, people can be punished for the things that they've done. And I think it's treble damages as well, which basically means if you're a victim of $10,000 worth of identity fraud, you can get at least $30,000. I haven't seen it done on the civil level. Unfortunately, a lot of the folks that are stealing resources don't have a lot of resources themselves, and so not necessarily the best people in the world to sue.
And I suspect most of the amounts are usually small bites, small amounts, $500 here, $600 there. So that kind of makes it also a little
And from the criminal side, what we want to do is put our victims back whole. So as a part of any punishment that we've got, if people are out money, if there's time that they had to spend, they were out of their job to get their identity put back into good shape, then we're going to want to make sure that that's covered as a part of the restitution in any sort of plea or sentencing after trial. So it's important to keep track of when you're correcting all the problems that have happened and trying to undo all the damage, that you keep track of your time and keep track of the amount of money that you're spending so that we can get that back for you when ultimately we prosecute the person who victimized you.
Okay. So let's talk about how do we avoid identity theft?
That's a great question.
I know there's a lot of common sense, a lot,
Sure.
but a lot of times we forget. A lot of good scams. I mean, they're getting so much better. We recently learned in another show a lot of robocalls now that have been used that make it sound very professional. This must be a legit company. It's a robocall. What do you suggest?
All right. First of all, buy a shredder. We get a lot of information that comes to us that's on. You'd be surprised. Credit card companies don't do it as much anymore, but you get credit card statements that has your credit card number on it. You'll also get your bank statements will come in that have your bank account number on them. Those are documents that you don't want to put in your trash. I mean, you put your trash out at night, the night before the collection comes, and there are people who will dumpster dive and go through your trash looking for identifying information that they can then use to make you a victim. So you want to shred that. The other thing you want to do is you want to keep track of what's going on with your financial resources. If somebody goes out and takes out a credit card, let's say at Sears, and you haven't shopped in Sears in probably the last 10 years, you'd have no idea that they're taking out a credit card there until you start getting bills from Sears, which you probably ignore because you think that you don't have a credit card account at Sears. And then a collection agency starts calling you about your Sears credit card account. What you can do to prevent that is that you're entitled to free credit reports, one from each of the three big ones, is Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. You can contact each one of those and get a free credit report from them. Now, that free credit report isn't going to have your credit score on it, but it is going to talk about any accounts that were taken out in your name. So what you should do is about every 4 months, contact those, each one of them.
One, right.
Get your free report. Another 4 months goes by, contact the other one, get your free report, and then finally contact the third one, and then rinse and repeat.
Do you know the website by any chance? Is it free credit report?
I've got to be careful with that one because some are run by the federal government and some are pay. You don't have to pay. Now, sometimes the score that you get, if you don't need to give your credit card number over to get a report.
And I suspect if you go through the ftc.gov website, there's probably going to be a link there.
Good point. There is actually, and I'd forgotten about that. But if you go to the ftc.gov website, they do have the links to the various credit reporting agency. Actually, in preparation for your show, I did that and went out and looked to see if that somebody had been using my credit information. Now, luckily, knock on, I guess, glass, but knock on wood that it wasn't used and I've not been a victim. But
Right, because important to know, I mean, there's a lot of websites out there that look very similar. You know, I try to do that myself.
Right.
And I even got confused a little bit. Is this the one that is free or not?
Right.
So you got to be very careful with those websites.
And even the credit reporting agencies like Experian or TransUnion, among their sites, will have where you can pay money to access your FICO score. You want to know. And if you're thinking about going out and buying a car or a house, that may be information that's useful for you to know what your score is. But in terms of protecting yourself from identity fraud, don't worry about your score. Worry about whether accounts are being taken out using your information.
All right, so buy a shredder. You can buy one for $20 these
Absolutely.
days. Be careful what you throw away, of course.
Yes.
Check your credit report.
Yep.
What else? Any other steps?
Be very careful about who you're giving your information to and who you're giving things to. If you write a check to somebody, they've now got your checking account number. You give somebody your credit card and all the information that comes with it, the security number on the back, the expiration date. They've now got your credit card. So know who you're giving your information to. A big scam that occurred a few years ago, Gene Canavan of our office in DeKalb County did a fantastic job prosecuting it. It made a lot of news, but it was the Georgia Powers case. A group of scamsters went out. They got a telephone number that was listed as Georgia Powers, and then they were calling elderly citizens, telling them that their power was going to be cut off. Mm-hmm. You know, they look down at caller ID, they say Georgia Power. They assume it's the power company, and so they were getting checking account numbers and I believe also credit cards from those folks and then using it to raid their bank accounts.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so frustrating because, I mean, even companies like Home Depot and Target,
right.
I mean, you use your credit card to shop and suddenly you're exposed to somebody stealing information.
Yeah, I mean, we can't go off the grid.
Okay. Right.
You know, and so what you got to do is just be careful with how you're using it.
Right, right. Well, Chris, unfortunately, we'll run out of time. I want to thank you for joining us today. That's a lot of good information you bring us.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Right,
thank you.
Thank you. And join us next Sunday at the same time. Until then, y'all behave or you will need a lawyer.
Leyes Cotidianas les llega a ustedes gracias al generoso apoyo financiero de la Fundación de Justicia Civil del Estado de Georgia. La estación transmisora WPBA no tiene licencia para practicar leyes en el estado de Georgia. WPBA y los patrocinadores de este programa no son responsables por las opiniones expresadas ni la información proporcionada por los abogados en este programa. Este programa se ofrece como un servicio público. El objetivo de este programa es de informar y educar y no de proveer consejo legal. Si usted necesita consejo legal, favor de consultar a un abogado.